Hello, I'm Dr. Bond. This is Bond Report. This is the study of BAFA, by assholes for assholes. This is number 6 in the series. Today we're going to talk about big data and how it's generated. Now the generation of big data, which you can look at meetings and see how it's done, which we will cover in further talks, there are large factories, to be sure, but still requires a lot of hard, hands-on peasant labor. Data is typically produced in a small, dark, quiet room lit to the level where you're growing cheese or growing mushrooms. And the sole and only total function of the audience, which I have sat in, is so you can say the paper was given at a certain meeting, typically the Academy or the Ascaris or something. Say this paper was given, it was accepted, and it was given at the Academy. And it's a few minutes long, and you sit through there and do that. Now, you watch this done on what you would call an industrial scale. If you sit in one of these rooms, where there'll be a row of these rooms going on all around you. And this is not padding. This is more like manufacturing upholstery to pad things with on an industrial scale. And it's kind of impressive. The big data that I have seen is like trying to speculate. The quality of that is like you're studying the behavior of chickens, and you're going to study that by closely analyzing a few chicken McNuggets. The thing is either too raw for the system to digest, or it's extremely highly processed beyond recognition. You can't go tell anything. I'm going off of a series of, I was giving a paper and, to polish my CV at a meeting a few years ago, and I was in there with all these young, fresh-faced doctors presenting these 7- and 8-minute papers in the small, dark room where you're trying to grow cheese. And I thought I would learn some glaucoma sitting there, and I came away after about 2 hours and a half of watching bad slides and poor reasoning, none the wiser for the investment of my morning, and I felt like I'd missed the boat entirely. And this was where these papers were being generated, so a bunch of guys upstairs can manufacture the big room. And do you want fries with that? Maybe some data, a little side data with that, maybe a little McData. It was, felt like it came out of a wrapper. And I was none the wiser about any clinical skills. Perhaps the fault was in me. I frankly didn't think so, but then you never do. Now you go to a meeting, and this is kind of like comics. You got the headliners, what the comics call, they're working the big room up there. They've got some things. And, Samuel Goldwyn saying, we got big actors who do big acting. And a lot of it's the coolie labor behind them. But when the headliners are out there working the big room, and some of these big rooms are pretty big, for us, they're going for Henry Ford II, writing a paper he gave later at the Ivy League. He was kicked out for plagiarism. He came back after a lot of big contributions years later and said, put his talk on there, which he was supposed to get his honorary doctorate, and said, I didn't write this one either. So that's the thing. Now, Jay Gould here, it was the custom of the time. He's talking about something else. He's talking about political contributions. And he was a stock guy, stock market manipulator, railroad guy. And he knew how to play this thing. And he said, well, I considered them I made political contributions, and I considered them to be sound investments that paid in Democratic districts. I was a Democrat. In Republican districts, I was a Republican, but I was an Erie Railroad man all the time. He owned the Erie Railroad. He had a bunch of stock manipulation. I was an Erie Railroad man all the time. That's those guys. They're taking possession of that things. And here is the puppet master, the surfmeister, the orchestrator of that is Mr. Academicus Twitticus with his minions. And he went through this, and they're all those things. A director said Billy Wilder, a policeman, a midwife, a psychoanalyst, a sycophant, and a bastard. And sometimes they'll go through those in 15 minutes. And you can get each one of those, like Kubler-Ross stages. There's 5 distinct ones, and you can meet all these people, knowing these academic guys in the stage of that time. Now, have they taught anybody anything? What do you teach your fellows, which is your name for your minions? If you're a resident, If you do post-resident training, you do that for 1 or 2 years typically, and you are called a fellow of the academy. Fellow, same word. You're a fellow, and you're becoming a fellow, and your guys are basically supposed to educate themselves and ask you questions. Well, Bismarck, when the Kaisers changed, it changed from Wilhelm I to Wilhelm II, he was asked, has the new Kaiser seemed to learn anything? And this is one of the reasons he got fired. And Bismarck said, I rode the same donkey through 9 campaigns. He didn't seem to learn much after the first one. And this, to me, is Academicus Twitticus with one of his minions. He's judging, you're supposed to educate yourself. Why are you bothering me? And I'm a guy who might answer a question if you have an intelligent one that doesn't bore me and I find interesting. In the meantime, why are you talking to me? Why don't you get back to work? I rode the same donkey, didn't seem to learn much after the first one. There's sort of this, it's not my affair. You know, now Big Dad, I wanted to get this because the enslaved potatoes you're doing there, and this is your guy, you're closely analyzing a few chicken McNuggets. They're either too not processed enough or they're too processed. You can't learn anything. This is McData. Here is Academicus Twitticus bossing his minions. That's Cecil B. DeMille. And, you know, he liked to affect this, whatever this is, Bushman in Africa dress. You're here to please me and nothing else matters. That's your beginning. They're whip crackers, these guys. Nothing else on earth matters. You're here to please me. You're a minion. Found a society of honest men. All the thieves will join it. They're all in there. So here is the sweatshop. And here we have a bunch of dressed up guys and girls here, but they're sweatshop labor, and they're working in there, and there is your academic Twitticus. There's his clinic, and those are his people, sweatshop working, writing those papers for him, getting that thing done. Now, why do people do that? As Edmund Burke said, the people will never give up their liberties, but under some delusion. And the delusion they have, they're wanting to get educated. They want to become an academicus Twitticus themselves. They want to have some extra knowledge. And you watch these people, as I sat in that little room and watched them, you watch them parade in and out. It was similar to one of those graduation ceremonies where they're doing it on the industrial scale. And it's like nothing so much as an assembly line. I remember being struck by that. So here they come, and they're being fed into the sweatshop. Here's Bismarck talking about you have sympathy for him, but this is what one of these academic guys will tell you. I have all the sympathy in the world for the Poles in this case, in their situation, but if we want to exist, we have no choice but to hammer them until they despair of living. Wolves are only what God made them, but we shoot them all the same. These are these people. They're here to be done in things. They're here to write papers for me. So this resembles the feudalism model, and these are your serfs. The indentured labor is forced to do the unrewarding work, for example, because you're filling your CV with big data. Now, the preferred labor force is always trainee doctors who are, at any rate, accustomed to being without human rights, any human rights, whatever, however basic. I myself was a trainee doctor. You're used to subsisting on anything, but it certainly isn't basic human rights. So I think their model is actually a fairly good choice of model. Here we have this young lady in the white coat and the sensible shoes. Now, she thinks she's being educated, but she is, in fact, being educated to some degree, but in fact providing cheap coolie labor. Now, she needs to get some word on the means of production to do a little Karl Marx here, but where is Jimmy Hoffa when you need him? As, you know, Gustave Flaubert said, you know, the future is the worst thing about the present. You think of what these people are working for. But where is Jimmy Hoffa when you need him? Well, nobody knows. Whenever you really need him, he seems to just disappear. Here's some labor organization. I could not resist a Teamster Union thing when I talk about Jimmy Hoffa. What did Jesus Christ say to the Teamsters and the Chicago Cubs? He said, fellas, don't do anything until I get back. So it's always been a favorite. I couldn't resist it. It'll maybe be edited. But in terms of just getting with labor here, as we spoke about labor and perhaps capital, Karl Marx certainly did not have the right answers, but he did have a few of the right questions. And this photograph, I've never seen him dressed up like this. He looks like he's headed to the dinner dance after the party meeting with a capital P, and no doubt have a little deviation. When Joseph Stalin was getting higher up in the Communist Party, he would have a particularly successful, his basic job was organizing robberies of Army payrolls and banks. And when they did that, these wild men would go on about a 3 or 4 day alcoholic bender. And Stalin always called these parties deviations, which is a little Bolshevik inside joke but here's Karl dressed up for a little deviation. You don't want to limit yourself too much on the basic human rights. Constitutions are fine as far as they go, but they need to be kept short and vague. This is the viewpoint of Academicus Twitticus, who's organizing these things. We're padding a CV here. Why don't you get back to work? Once again, a sweatshop. Each guy's got a job he knows how to do, but you're working sweatshop. And so, these young and eager, as I remember sitting here in this little room watching this, waiting to give my paper, highly intelligent, motivated, young, eager, incredibly hardworking people seeking a good faith education wind up as pawns in a game, somebody else's chess game, that they're not even on there to win. They're just there to take a bullet. So these young, there they are. Now, admittedly, and they can do this, there are odds against this, but a pawn can reach the 8th rank, become a full Academicus Twitticus, the queen, in her own right. It's a long way to go. It's a hazardous way to low. You typically don't wind up with all the pawns you started with. As you sit in these meetings and watch them churn through these papers with a few sentences, it's typically a strict time limit, so we can get as many in there to pad as many CVs as you can. You don't have to be very old for the presenters to look very, very young. And so as the paper presenters say, surf's up. A little play on words there. There's your trainee doctors. They don't have their basic human rights to interfere with you. Surf's up. In not rare cases, the surfmeister will think he is contributing to the sum of human knowledge through his activities rather than decreasing it. There's a quote about that. I have a different teaching style here that I like, but it can be either the Jerry Lewis style or this gentleman. We're contributing. And what I'm quoting there is Thomas Reed, who was once a vice president of the United States and later became a Speaker of the House, talking about some of his fellow congressmen. He said they could not open their mouths without subtracting from the sum total of human knowledge. A great quote, and that's what I was referring to. You get some of these guys talking about somebody else's work, and it's interesting there. Now, if you go to one of these talks of the sweatshop warriors, the talk is not commonly heard well. It's not listened to, it's not questioned, it's not commented upon. It's read tonelessly by minions to other minions. They are only there. They are normally glance around the room and nobody's listening. They're commonly on their own computers, checking their own talk, and one hopes they're not writing, their own presentations at that point, but they're checking their own computers. Nobody's listening. Nobody's really talking. You're getting through that so you can go to the next one and see you did it. It's sweatshop labor. And it's gotten through in the manner of all sweatshop labor everywhere. Nobody's listening. They're all on their computers, getting their own talks ready, or they're just on their computers in general, which is what it seems like if you have any children of a certain age. You will hear, as you try to listen to these papers, they'll typically have these abominable slides that were used in some classroom. It's a very different size from the room you're in. And it's just rushed through. Nobody thinks they're going to get watched. Nobody says anything. And George Orwell said it. It's common in certain kinds of writing, particularly art criticism or literary criticism, to come across long passages which are entirely devoid of meaning. I would have thought that was an exaggeration till you sit through this, and I know all of the things and the initialisms and that stuff, and you do come across long passages that are entirely devoid of meaning. George Orwell's talking about something else. You do know a few things. Von Rundstedt asked Dwight Eisenhower, they're going to some kind of a peace talk, and he happens to casually ask Dwight Eisenhower if he knows any German. Well, Eisenhower told him, well, I know the word for iron worker. So you do have some casual things, which is Eisenhower. There he is, but what do you know? I know that. Now, if you go to try to talk to one of these people and clarify their paper afterwards, they've got 4 or 5 papers they're giving that morning, so their guy can be more effectively done. They've traded their work around, but they've got a rigid schedule. They can't stay and talk. They can't discuss papers. They can't say what they just said. Well, partner, you've got the Pony Express here. I'd like to stop and maybe learn something new, but I see my computer there. I got 4 more of these here talks that I've got to give today or I'll be in big trouble. I'd sure enough like to, though, see you. I got to go. The Pony Express, they said they preferred orphans, but they wanted young people. They said they preferred orphans. They made the work dangerous. The average Pony Express rider is 18 or 19 years old. They want somebody who's very young. And George Patton said it the best. Nobody ever runs out of poor bastards. You know, you get them, you use them. Here's Joe Hill. I'm dating myself here. Joan Baez sang about him at Woodstock. He was an actual guy, and he was murdered by the guys as he's trying to unionize. He's a hero of organized labor. He was murdered in 1915. But that's Joe Hill. Work all day, live on hay, eat pie in the sky when you die. Supposedly he wrote that. Getting that. Now, an interesting thing from people that run actual assembly lines. They try to get robots on there. Well, can big data production be made robotic? To which my answer would be, it kind of already has. Well, I've seen it done. There is your sweatshop. There is your results. Thank you very much. Subscribe. Watch other talks. Thank you.